3.1 Introduction. According to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, Denmark is the world's 9th richest country out of a total of 192 countries, and the 3rd richest among the 27 EU member states. Gross domestic product, GDP, per capita, that is, the value of total Danish production over the course of 1 year, divided among each of the country's 6 million inhabitants, thus amounted in 2025 to $72,000, corresponding to just under 500,000 Danish kroner. However, every society has only limited resources, money, and this also applies to wealthy countries such as Denmark. The word economy itself comes from Greek and means household management, that is, how income and expenditures are managed. Therefore, economics is also politics. One of the questions that is most important to both the population and politicians is how resources should be distributed and how to make the economy grow. The Danish economy is often described as a mixed economy. This means that it operates within the framework of a private market economy, while the public sector also plays a major role in the economy. Thus, some goods and services are produced, bought, and sold on the private market, for example, food, furniture, or taxi services, while others, typically services, for example, education, hospital treatment, or childcare, are provided by the public sector and paid for through taxes and duties. In addition, the public sector also redistributes large sums of money among citizens through, for example, transfer incomes such as unemployment benefits, social assistance, and pensions. The private and public sectors depend on each other. Private businesses earn money and provide jobs, thereby ensuring that taxes are paid, which among other things finance public welfare. Conversely, for example, the public education system provides qualified labor for the business sector, while the public healthcare system ensures that employees recover more quickly and can return to work after illness, and childcare institutions ensure that children can be cared for so their parents can go to work. This chapter describes some overall characteristics of the Danish economy within the following areas: the welfare state, the business sector, the labor market. 3.2 The welfare state. The Danish welfare state is based on a principle that each individual citizen has both rights and obligations. Citizens who meet certain conditions are entitled to the benefits of the welfare state. However, each citizen also has a duty to contribute to the community, partly by paying taxes and partly by working, if they are able to do so. If one is outside the labor market and receives public support, one also has an obligation to make an active effort to return to the labor market. Overall, this way of thinking represents a kind of informal contract between the state and its citizens, involving both duties and rights. The Danish model of the welfare state shares many characteristics with those of the other Nordic countries. It is often referred to as the Nordic model. There are also many similarities with other wealthy countries, but there are nevertheless some areas in which the Danish and Nordic welfare model stands out. The state has a major responsibility for citizens' welfare from cradle to grave. Childcare is available for all children. Children and young people have access to free education. Everyone is guaranteed treatment in case of illness. There is assistance or care for the elderly and others who cannot manage on their own. And there is financial support for those who cannot work and support themselves. Most welfare benefits are financed collectively by the entire population through taxes and duties. In many other countries, welfare benefits are mainly financed through social contributions paid by employees and employers. In Denmark, entitlement to benefits is normally not dependent on having been employed and having paid social contributions, as is the case in several countries south of Denmark in Europe. Welfare benefits are made available to all citizens once they meet the conditions for receiving them. Great emphasis is placed on service tasks that relieve families. This applies in particular to childcare, nurseries, kindergartens, after-school programs, and elder care, home care, nursing homes, and similar services. Several European countries have, in certain areas, drawn inspiration from the Nordic welfare model. The Danish way of organizing the welfare state makes it possible for both men and women to participate actively in the labor market, even if they have children. In Danish families with children, both the father and the mother typically work full-time or nearly full-time. Here, too, European countries have moved in the same direction as the Nordic countries. 3.2.1 The development of the Danish welfare model. In all societies, it is typically the working adults who take care of the elderly, children, and those who, for one reason or another, are unable to manage on their own. Historically, this has often been organized within the individual family or in local communities. In Denmark, an ever larger share of these tasks has gradually been taken over by the welfare state. This has happened through the gradual creation of a system in which all citizens of society have the right to receive financial and practical assistance based on uniform criteria. The first steps toward the welfare state as it is known today were taken in the 1890s. This occurred during a period of major economic and social change. Agriculture was restructured, industry emerged and expanded, and cities grew. With the transformation of the old agricultural and craft-based society, a number of private social arrangements disappeared. Instead, the state increasingly began to take responsibility for citizens who needed assistance. More, and gradually more fixed, rules were introduced regarding who could be granted social benefits in cases of illness, accidents, unemployment, and old age. At the same time, more and more people gained access to these benefits. In 1933, a major social reform was implemented as part of the so-called Kanslergaard Agreement. With this reform, 55 social policy laws were consolidated into 4 people's insurance laws. A stronger emphasis on the principle of entitlement was also introduced. That is, clearer rules about when and how much assistance an individual citizen could receive. Until then, it had largely been up to individual municipalities to assess whether a citizen was entitled to assistance and how much could be granted. Furthermore, the reform abolished most of the so-called disqualification provisions in social legislation. This meant that it became a fundamental principle that one could not lose the right to vote or other civil rights, simply because one received public assistance. The most important foundations of the present-day welfare state were laid in the 1950s and 1960s. During this period, several of the basic principles of the welfare state were established. The social safety net was expanded, among other things, through the Old Age Pension Acts of 1956 and 1964, which introduced a universal state pension for all elderly people, not only the most disadvantaged. At the same time, service provisions began to develop. Previously, the state had primarily provided cash benefits, that is, financial assistance, to citizens who had lost their income due to unemployment, illness, accidents, or old age. During this period, however, the welfare state also came to include a range of services that took over tasks that families had previously been responsible for on their own. This applied particularly to childcare and home help for the elderly. The principle of assistance to the needy citizen was increasingly supplemented by a principle whereby the entire population, rich as well as poor, could benefit from the various services. It was especially from the mid-1960s to the late 1970s that the major expansion of service provisions took place. This occurred at the same time as nearly all women, including married women, entered the labor market, so that the stay-at-home housewife almost disappeared. From 1980 until around the year 2000, this development continued as the majority of married women moved from part-time to full-time or nearly full-time employment. It was particularly the public sector's takeover of childcare, elder care, and similar services that made this possible. Almost all children between the ages of 1 and 6 receive childcare, while most children aged 7 to 10 are cared for in after-school programs. Maternity and parental leave have also been extended several times, from only a few weeks in the 1970s to the 52 weeks with full benefits that have been in effect since 2002. The welfare state depends on economic development in society. In the period 1957 to 1973, there was strong economic growth. The expansion of the public sector also continued at a high pace throughout the 1970s, despite a prolonged economic crisis. However, it became increasingly clear that the economy was struggling to sustain the growth in public expenditure. As a result, growth was curbed in the 1980s, and since then, the increase in public spending has continued at a more limited pace, roughly in line with overall economic growth. One of the greatest long-term challenges for the welfare state in Denmark and other European countries is that fewer people are paying for the welfare that more people are benefiting from. This is primarily due to rising life expectancy, but also to low birth rates over many decades. For this reason, it is often said that the so-called dependency burden, or demographic pressure, has increased. From 1980 to 2025, the proportion of citizens in Denmark over the age of 64 grew from 14% to 21% of the total population. A significant part of the solution has therefore been to extend the economically active age, that is, the age at which people are generally part of the labor market. In 2006, the Danish parliament decided that the state pension age should be raised in line with increasing life expectancy. The state pension age was 65 up to and including 2018, but has been gradually increased, first to 67 in 2022, then to 68 from 2030, and to 69 from 2035. In addition, early retirement benefits were shortened in 2011. Early retirement had been introduced in 1979 as a right for people over the age of 60 to withdraw from the labor market before reaching the pension age. In recent years, there has also been a smaller movement in the opposite direction. From 2022, people who, at the age of 61, have spent a long time, 42 to 44 years, in the labor market have been given the right to retire 1 to 3 years before the state pension age, early pension. Early pension is also known as the Arne pension, named after brewery worker Arne Juhl, who became the face of the Social Democrats' election campaign in the 2019 general election to introduce the scheme. The early retirement age was gradually raised from 60 to 62 between 2014 and 2017, and the benefit period was then gradually shortened to 3 years, so that from 2023 it has been possible to receive early retirement benefits from the age of 64 to 67. For most recipients, the benefit has also been reduced, as it is now more closely adjusted according to how much pension savings the recipient has. Efforts have also been made to get more people into work by shortening the so-called unemployment benefit period. That is, the period during which an unemployed person can receive benefits from an unemployment insurance fund, a kasse. In 1993, a limit of 7 years was set for the benefit period, which has since been gradually reduced to 5 years in 1995, 4 years in 1998, and since 2010, it has been set at 2 years. At the same time, greater demands are now placed on accepting work other than that for which one is trained. In addition, income taxes have been lowered for people in employment, including through a so-called employment allowance, that is, an amount of income that is not taxed if one is employed or earns a surplus in one's business. This increases the incentive to work even in low-paid jobs. Finally, a number of initiatives have been implemented to increase employment among groups that have had difficulty finding work. As a result, it has become more difficult for people with a permanent and significant reduction in work capacity to obtain disability pension. Instead, they have been given the opportunity to work in so-called flex jobs, where they earn part of their income themselves and receive a public benefit for the remainder. Employment among people with a non-Western immigrant background has also increased overall since 1995, though with significant fluctuations over time. For example, employment declined for several years after the financial crisis of 2008, before rising again from 2015 to 16. Nevertheless, many in this group remain outside the labor market. In 2023, 67% of immigrants with a non-Western background aged 25 to 64 were employed, compared with 83% of people of Danish origin in the same age group. High employment in Denmark contributes to a high standard of living and enables Denmark to finance an expanded public sector. 3.2.2 Equality and Redistribution. The Danish welfare state is characterized by a significant degree of economic redistribution. This redistribution takes place both through the tax system, because those who earn the most pay the most in taxes, and through the provision of welfare benefits, which are available to everyone and especially to those who are not in employment. Inequality, therefore, declined markedly in the period 1945 to 80. This was due in particular to the rapid expansion of the welfare state, large wage increases, and long periods of low unemployment. Although inequality has increased since the 1980s, Denmark in 2025 still has a relatively high degree of economic equality compared with other countries. The Danish welfare state is financed through taxes on, for example, income, as well as through value-added tax, VAT, and excise duties on goods and services. Both the state and the municipalities have the right to levy income tax. In 1903, income tax was introduced as a permanent tax at a significantly lower rate than today. Income tax means that almost all income is taxable, regardless of its source. The Danish income tax is progressive. This means that the tax rate increases as income rises. As a result, people with high incomes not only pay a higher amount in tax than people with lower incomes, but also a larger share of their earnings. Income taxes make up a large portion of total taxation in Denmark. Income taxes redistribute more than consumption taxes, such as VAT, because people with lower incomes typically spend a larger share of their earnings, on which they therefore pay VAT, while people with higher incomes typically save a larger proportion of their income. Everyone has a so-called personal allowance, an amount on which no income tax is paid, of the first 51,600 Danish kroner, 2025, earned per year. On income above 51,600 Danish kroner, one pays 12% in state tax and approximately 25% in municipal tax. If one is a member of the Church of Denmark, one typically also pays around 1% in church tax. From 2026, the state's taxation of the highest incomes will be restructured so that one pays an intermediate tax of 7.5% on income above 618,400 Danish kroner per year. a top tax of 15% on income above 750,000 Danish kroner per year, a top tax of 20% on income above 2.5 million Danish kroner per year. 3.2.3 Tasks and actors in the welfare state. The welfare state provides a wide range of benefits and services to citizens. It is common to distinguish between two different types of welfare tasks carried out by the public sector. First, the public sector assists citizens who have difficulty supporting themselves and therefore need financial help. Approximately 1/3 of total public expenditure is spent on cash benefits, transfer payments to citizens. These are typically granted to people without employment and include, among other things, the state pension, disability pension, the state educational grant, SU, maternity benefits, child and youth benefits, unemployment and sickness benefits, and social assistance. However, families with children also receive cash benefits, child and youth benefits, which are justified by the fact that they have higher expenses than families without children or young people living at home. Second, the public sector provides a range of public services to all citizens who need them. These include, for example, nurseries and kindergartens, hospitals, elder care, and many forms of education. The Danish Parliament and the government set the overall framework for the Danish welfare state through legislation. However, it is primarily the 98 municipalities that fill out this framework in practice. The municipalities are responsible for delivering most welfare services directly to citizens. In addition, the 5 regions are responsible for operating most of the healthcare system. The municipalities function as citizens' main point of entry to the public sector. They are responsible for the majority of tasks that are closest to the individual citizen. These include, among other things, childcare in nurseries and kindergartens, primary and lower secondary schools, folkskole, elder care, libraries, and several other cultural services, job centers and efforts to help unemployed people into work, integration of refugees and immigrants, allocation of a wide range of social benefits, waste collection, and other environmental tasks. The state is responsible for a number of overarching tasks, such as the police, the judicial system, and defense, as well as tasks including upper secondary education, general upper secondary schools and similar institutions, higher education, and research. In connection with the structural reform of 2007, the state also took over all tax collection from the municipalities. In Denmark, the welfare state is thus fundamentally a public responsibility carried out by the state, the regions, and the municipalities. However, other actors are also involved. Over recent decades, it has become more common to allow private companies to carry out some welfare tasks, although the public sector still pays for them. This is known as outsourcing. Within elder care, for example, individuals are free to choose whether they wish to receive home care services from the municipality or from a private provider. There is also a strong Danish tradition of involving volunteers in solving welfare tasks. As the name implies, volunteers contribute their efforts without payment. Associations and voluntary work are far more widespread in the Nordic countries than in almost all other countries. There are many voluntary organizations, which among other things, run shelters for victims of violence, visitation schemes for the elderly, drop-in centers, and much more. The general principle is that voluntary work should supplement public services rather than replace them. Accordingly, it is still relatively rare for voluntary organizations to be responsible for providing core welfare services. Voluntary organizations also play a very large role in cultural and leisure activities. This is especially true in sports, where thousands of volunteers act as coaches, for example, for children playing football, handball, or other sports. Denmark also has a tradition of so-called free schools, friskoler, which dates back to the mid-19th century. Free schools are owned by an association behind the school rather than by the municipality and are therefore often referred to as private schools. They receive a municipal subsidy corresponding to a large share of the normal cost of a municipal primary school, with a smaller portion paid by parents. Free schools exist throughout the country, and some are very old. In Denmark, however, most are run on the basis of a particular educational philosophy or a desire to maintain a local school. Most children still attend municipal primary schools, but in recent years there has been a significant increase in the proportion of children attending free schools or private schools, from about 12% in 2007 to 19% in 2023. Parental involvement is also central in Danish schools, kindergartens, and nurseries. For example, there are boards elected by parents. There are many parent meetings and activities where participation by all parents is expected. In almost all classes, so-called contact parents are elected to organize meetings and social events and to serve as a link to the school board. This role usually rotates, so most parents take part for a period. Finally, public welfare benefits are supplemented by agreements, collective agreements, between the social partners in the labor market, trade unions, and employer organizations. This applies, for example, in the area of pensions, where almost everyone today has a so-called occupational pension, to which they contribute a certain percentage of their wages, typically 12 to 17%. The occupational pension is built on top of the state pension. While the state pension is intended to secure the basic needs of all citizens, especially the most vulnerable in old age, occupational pensions depend on the individual's income during their working life. For many people with middle or higher incomes, the occupational pension they receive is significantly higher than the state pension. In addition to pensions, these schemes typically also provide benefits in the event of critical illness and coverage in cases of illness and death. Although not all employees are covered by a collective agreement, it has become the norm for the vast majority of jobs to include a pension scheme. Finally, there is also a large private pension market, where individuals can save for their retirement through a bank or an insurance company. 3.3.1 From an agricultural society to a knowledge and service society. Like most other affluent countries, Denmark has gradually developed from being an agricultural society to an industrial society, and, over the past 50 years, into what is known as a knowledge and service society. This means that the economy has shifted from being primarily based on the production of goods to becoming increasingly dependent on highly educated labor, with a focus on using knowledge, developing new ideas, and producing services such as banking, IT support, research, and education. Until the late 19th century, the majority of the population worked in agriculture. From the 1870s, however, industry and crafts grew rapidly. The population moved from rural areas to cities, and cities expanded. Agriculture nevertheless remained important, especially because agricultural products made up the bulk of Denmark's exports. There was a strong focus on high-quality animal production, such as meat, butter, and cheese, organized through the many cooperative dairies and slaughterhouses. Up until the late 1950s, agricultural products accounted for more than half of Denmark's exports. Agricultural production is still substantial, but since the 1950s, there has been extensive rationalization and efficiency gains, and today, only about 2% of the workforce is employed directly in agriculture. However, agriculture remains an important export sector. In this context, People often speak of a food cluster because fewer people are employed in primary agricultural production and more are employed in processing, transport, sales, marketing, and product development. Agriculture is also undergoing transformation in other ways. It has been criticized for being overly efficient in problematic ways, including the excessive use of pesticides to kill weeds, fungi, and insects. This has contributed to a gradual green transition, so that Denmark today is the country with the largest share of agricultural land, 11.4% in 2023, farmed organically. Organic farming is conducted without the use of chemical pesticides and artificial fertilizers, and animals generally have more space in stables and better opportunities to go outdoors. The first major wave of industrialization in Denmark occurred in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Growth continued steadily, though at a somewhat slower pace, until the second major wave of industrialization from the late 1950s to around 1970. From the early 1970s, the share of employment in industry declined, just as had previously occurred in agriculture. Instead, the service sector expanded. Today, nearly 4 out of 5 employed people work in private or public service industries, for example, tourism, healthcare, consultancy, or education. About 30% of employees in Denmark work in the public sector. The production of agricultural and industrial goods has nevertheless increased, even though the number of employees has declined. This is mainly due to the mechanization of production and rapid technological development in these sectors. Denmark has previously been characterized by the fact that most companies were small or medium-sized. This is still largely the case, but more companies have emerged that play a significant role on the global market within industries, where Denmark is particularly strong. This applies, for example, to the food industry, where dairies and slaughterhouses have merged into international giants. Danish Crown was the world's second largest pork slaughterhouse in 2024, and Arla was among the 10 largest dairies in the world in 2024. Carlsberg was the world's 4th largest brewery in 2023. Denmark also has a large pharmaceutical industry. Several Danish pharmaceutical companies hold a significant share of the global market, of which Novo Nordisk is the largest. Denmark also produces more than 1/3 of the world's hearing aids. The 3 largest Danish manufacturers, GN Store Nord, GN Resound, William Demant, Oticon, and Widex, are among the world's largest hearing aid producers. In addition, Lego is one of the world's largest toy companies. Lego was founded in 1932, and the name is an abbreviation of Leg Godt, play well. Its headquarters are located in Billund in Jutland. Lego is known for producing plastic building bricks. Denmark has always been a major maritime nation, and in 2024 had the world's 10th largest merchant fleet and the world's 2nd largest container shipping company in 2023, Maersk. In addition, there are companies in the green sector. The Danish company Vestas was the world's largest wind turbine manufacturer in 2024. Denmark is also very strong in the field of energy efficiency, for example, in insulation and highly energy efficient products. 3.3.2 Denmark's trade with other countries. Denmark has a very open economy in which trade with other countries plays a very major role. Exports account for approximately half of the country's total production. This is, of course, also because Denmark is a small country, and trade with other countries, especially neighboring countries, therefore carries great weight. Germany is the country from which Denmark imports, buys the most, while the United States is the country to which Denmark exports, sells the most. Overall, however, exports to other EU countries are clearly greater than exports to the United States. In 2024, Denmark's 7 largest trading partners were as follows, measured by their share of the total value of Denmark's foreign trade, imports, and exports. The United States, 15.0%, Germany, 12.8%, Sweden, 7.7%, the Netherlands, 5.5%, the United Kingdom, 5.0%, China, 4.7%, and Norway, 3.9%. In modern times, Danish governments have almost always been supporters of as much free trade between countries as possible. Since the 1990s, Denmark has also performed better in international competition. During the same period, Danish exports have exceeded imports in almost every year. Denmark is a member of a number of international organizations that, like the EU, also work to promote freer trade. These include, for example, the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the WTO, World Trade Organization. Economic globalization has brought about major changes in the Danish labor market. Many companies have moved parts of their production to places in the world where wages are lower, not only to China, but also, for example, to Eastern Europe or other European countries. So far, however, companies have typically retained some important functions in Denmark, such as the development of new products, sales, and management. At the same time, new large markets have also emerged for Danish products. 3.4. The labor market. Most people of working age participate in the Danish labor market. This applies to both men and women. In 2025, 77.6% of the population aged 16 to 64 were employed, 79.4% of men, and 75.8% of women. In addition, the Danish labor market is characterized by a generally well-educated workforce. For many years, the goal has been for almost everyone to complete some form of education after compulsory schooling, folkeskole, although this has not been achieved to the full extent hoped for. On the other hand, Denmark is one of the countries in the world with the strongest tradition of continuing and further education, that is, ongoing education throughout working life. Education is also increasingly necessary, as many jobs that do not require formal qualifications have been taken over by machines or robots, moved abroad, or simply eliminated. People often speak of a distinct Danish labor market model, which has roots going back more than 100 years. During the early industrialization in the late 19th century, a growing working class gradually emerged in the cities. Workers organized themselves into trade unions in the various occupational fields, whose main umbrella organization is the Danish Trade Union Confederation, Fagbevægelsens Hovedorganisation, FH, which aimed to fight for better wages and working conditions. In response, employers organized themselves in the Danish Employers' Confederation, today known as DA. Several of the principles underlying the Danish labor market stem from the September Compromise, which the social partners concluded in 1899. The agreement is therefore also referred to as the Constitution of the Labor Market, and includes, among other things, mutual recognition by trade unions and employer organizations of each other's right to negotiate on behalf of their members. The two parties can thus conclude agreements that cover several groups of employers and employees. Such an agreement is called a collective agreement. It typically sets wages and working conditions. The September Compromise also establishes that employers have the right to manage and allocate work, and to hire and dismiss employees. Finally, the agreement includes a so-called peace obligation. This means that strikes, when employees stop working, and lockouts, when employers send employees home, are not permitted while a collective agreement is in force. Overall, the Danish labor market model is based on the following 5 central elements. The majority of the workforce is organized in trade unions. The social partners themselves negotiate wages and working conditions on the labor market, self-regulation. As a general rule, the state does not intervene here, as it does in some other countries, unless the parties, after lengthy negotiations, appear unable to reach an agreement. A very large part of the labor market is covered by collective agreements. There is a so-called tripartite cooperation between employees, employers, and the state concerning labor market conditions. There is both flexibility and security, flexicurity. It is relatively easy to hire and fire employees in Denmark, but unemployed people also receive public benefits, which are partly self-financed. 3.4.1 High level of union membership. In the Danish labor market, a large majority of employees are members of trade unions, although the share has declined over recent decades. Nearly 2 out of 3 employees, 65%, were members of a trade union in 2023. It is almost only the Nordic countries that have such a high level of organization. Trade unions work to secure the best possible conditions for their members in the workplace. There are trade unions for both private sector and public sector employees. Both trade unions and employers' organizations are gathered in nationwide federations and umbrella organizations. The largest umbrella organization on the employee side is the Danish Trade Union Confederation, Fagbevægelsens Hovedorganisation, FH. FH is an umbrella organization for a total of 64 trade unions and organizes approximately 1 million members. DA is the main employers' organization and represents 11 employers' associations with around 25,000 companies in sectors such as industry, trade, transport, services, and construction. With its 20,000 member companies employing about 650,000 workers, the Confederation of Danish Industry, Dansk Industry, DI, is Denmark's largest employers and business organization and the largest member organization within DA. The second largest business organization is Dansk Erhverv, which represents 18,000 companies, typically smaller than those affiliated with DI. There is freedom of association in Denmark. This means, among other things, that each employee may decide for themselves whether they wish to be a member of a trade union, and if so, which one. It also means that it is prohibited for an employer to dismiss an employee because they are a member of a trade union, just as it is prohibited to dismiss an employee because they are not a member of a trade union. In connection with new employment, it is also not permitted to require that an employee be a member of a particular trade union. 3.4.2 Self-regulation and collective agreements. The state, therefore, does not intervene in wages and working conditions as long as the social partners themselves are able to conclude agreements in these areas. These agreements also cover matters that, in most other countries, would be decided by laws passed by parliament and government. This may include working hours, overtime pay, notice periods, or minimum wages. Denmark thus has no statutory minimum wage, but the agreements between trade unions and employers' organizations in practice have the same effect. Another example is employees' pensions, where the social partners have agreed on occupational pension schemes on top of the state pension paid by the government. In recent years, agreements have also been reached to ensure full pay, including pension contributions, during a larger part of the parental leave period. It is also the social partners themselves who seek to resolve any conflicts that may arise. The underlying idea is that the social partners can adapt agreements more quickly and effectively to the individual sector or company. And when the parties themselves have been involved in concluding an agreement, they are also more likely to accept its terms. More than 80% of the Danish labor market is covered by collective agreements. A collective agreement is an agreement between a trade union and an employer or employers' organization on wages and working conditions within a specific area defined by the parties themselves. An employer who has entered into a collective agreement is obliged to grant all employees the wages and working conditions stipulated in the agreement. This applies, for example, to agreements on pay, pensions, working hours, holidays, and notice of termination. If the parties do not reach agreement on a new collective agreement, when an existing one expires, a labor market conflict arises. This means that employees may go on strike, or employers may lock out their employees, send them home from work without pay. To prevent labor market conflicts, the state has, since 1910, established a so-called conciliation institution, often referred to as the conciliator. If a conflict between the social partners appears likely, the conciliator may, for example, summon the parties to negotiations or present a so-called mediation proposal, which is a proposal for a settlement compromise between the parties. The conciliator may also postpone an impending labor market conflict, typically by a few weeks. Major labor market conflicts occur relatively rarely, but they have happened several times. The most recent major conflict in the private labor market took place in 1998. This involved, for example, many buses not running and shops not receiving deliveries of goods. In such cases, the government and the Danish parliament, typically, as they also did in 1998, fairly quickly pass a law imposing a collective agreement so that employees return to work and the situation normalizes again. In these cases, parliamentary legislation has always been based on a mediation proposal put forward by the labor market conciliator. In this context, one speaks of turning a mediation proposal into law. 3.4.3 Tripartite Cooperation and Flexicurity. The state also typically cooperates on an ongoing basis with the social partners in shaping those parts of labor market policy that are determined through legislation. This applies, for example, to rules on the working environment, employment services, labor market training, and unemployment insurance. This cooperation is known as tripartite cooperation because it involves three parties: the state, employers, and employees. The purpose of the cooperation is to ensure a labor market that is both flexible for employers and secure for employees. Flexibility consists in the fact that it is relatively easy for employers to dismiss employees when the economic situation is poor and to hire employees when conditions improve. Security consists in the fact that employees have economic protection in the form of unemployment benefits if they lose their job. This also makes it less risky to change jobs. Employees are furthermore guaranteed assistance in returning to the labor market, for example, through education, traineeships, or other activation measures. This combination of flexibility and security is often referred to as the Danish flexicurity model.